At 19, I buried my mom and came home to my autistic sister mid-meltdown. No money, no family, no plan. 3 months later, I walked into the guardianship office alone. The clerk asked, "Where's your guardian?" I said, "You're looking at her." The day my mother was buried, I came home to a 4-year-old screaming because her sock seam wasn't sitting right. I know that doesn't sound like much. A sock, a seam, a little girl in the middle of the living room floor, red-faced and thrashing, pulling at her shoe as it had personally offended her. But I was 19 years old. I had just watched them lower my mother into the ground. I hadn't eaten since the day before. My black dress still smelled like the funeral home's cheap floral air freshener, that suffocating mix of lilies and something synthetic. Made something that's supposed to make death feel dignified but really just makes it feel processed. And I was standing in the doorway of our apartment in East Vancouver with grocery bags cutting into my wrists, staring at my little sister Nora, 4 years old, her dark curls wild around her face, absolutely unraveling over a sock seam. And I remember thinking, this is my life now, not as a complaint, not as a cry for help, just a fact, cold and hard and settling into my chest like a stone dropping into deep water. This is it. This is what comes next. Not a university, not figuring out who I am at 19, not the year abroad I'd been daydreaming about since I was 15, not the slow and ordinary process of becoming. This, a sock, a seam, a child who cannot tell me what hurts. This is the whole world now, and I have to figure out how to live inside it. I set down the grocery bag, I took off my heels, I sat down on the floor in my funeral dress, and I waited for Nora to come back to me. My name is Maya. I'm 20 now, though I feel much older and much younger at the same time. Older in the way that people who've carried a lot of weight early get older, like the muscle memory of hardship ages your bones even when your face stays the same. Younger in the sense that I still feel, sometimes, like a teenager waiting for the adults to come handle things. The adults never came. They were never coming. I had to become one myself, faster than I was ready for, and I'm still not entirely sure I've managed it. Some days I feel very grown. Some days I feel like a child wearing a grown-up's coat, hoping no one looks too closely at the hem dragging on the floor. I want to tell you this story because I spent months feeling completely alone inside it, like no one could understand what it meant to be a 19-year-old girl suddenly responsible for 2 small children with no parents, no family, no safety net, just me, an apartment, a very limited bank account, and 2 little girls who had lost everything they knew. I want to tell it because I've seen other people carry impossible things in silence, and silence doesn't help anyone. It just makes the impossible thing feel more impossible, because you're also carrying the weight of having to pretend it's manageable. And I want to tell you because it actually gets better. Not perfect, not easy, not the way you'd write it if you had a choice, but better, in the real, incremental, and sometimes barely perceptible way that things get better when you're doing the actual work. And I think you deserve to hear that part too. Because the stories that only tell the hard parts without the turning, those stories leave you in the dark. I don't want to leave you in the dark. So let me start at the beginning. My mother, Renata, was 38 when she died. She was beautiful in that specific way that people who've been through a lot are sometimes beautiful. There was something weathered and luminous about her at the same time, like sea glass, like something that had been rough and tumbled and come out smooth and faintly glowing. She had this enormous laugh that I used to find embarrassing when I was 12 and 13. When everything she did felt like too much, too loud, too present, too Renata. I would have given anything, when in those last months, to hear her laugh like that again, to feel embarrassed by it, to be 12 and rolling my eyes at my mother's laugh in a grocery store, not 20, and standing in a funeral home picking out which dress they'd put her in. She was funny. She was magnetic in that slightly chaotic way, the kind of person who made friends in line at the pharmacy and remembered their names 3 years later. She could make any room feel warmer just by being in it. And she could also make any room feel like a crisis, because she brought the full weight of herself everywhere she went. Her joy, her instability, her love, her fear. There was no half measure with Renata. She was all the way in, always, which meant that when she was good, she was radiant, and when she was struggling, she was a storm. And she spent a lot of my childhood somewhere between the two. She had been struggling with addiction for most of my memory. I didn't have a name for it when I was small. I just knew that sometimes my mother was very present, and sometimes she was somewhere else. Even when she was sitting right next to me. I knew there were nights when I put myself to bed. I knew there were school mornings when I made my own breakfast and walked myself out the door. I knew there was a version of my mother who braided my hair and another version who didn't know what day it was, and they lived inside the same person. And I loved them both because I didn't know how to love them separately. By the time I was 14, I understood more. By 15, I was covering for her regularly. By 17, I was essentially running the household whenever she was in a bad stretch, paying bills she'd forgotten, making sure there was food, managing whatever crisis had arisen that week. I never framed it as a burden. It was just what we did. It was just our family's particular shape. You don't question the shape of the thing when you've never known it to be any other way. My biological father was gone before I was old enough to understand what a father was. He left, and he stayed gone, And I made my peace with that a long time ago. Or something that functions like peace. That flat, quiet place you reach with certain griefs, when you've processed them so thoroughly that they stop hurting in any active way and just become a part of the landscape. He's not a character in this story. Some absences are too complete to fill. I stopped trying to fill them a long time ago. My sister Lily, who was 5 when our mother died, had a different father, a man named Daniel. He and my mother had a few good years, from what I understand, though they didn't last. Daniel was kind, I think. He had a steady quality, a groundedness that I suspect Lily inherited. She has his smile, wide and easy and completely unguarded, the kind of smile that makes strangers smile back. I'm grateful she has it. There are days when I look at Lily and feel a specific, bittersweet gratitude for everything she inherited from the people who couldn't stay. And then there's Nora. Nora's father, Marcus, died in a car accident when my mother was 7 months pregnant with her. A winter night, ice on the highway, and then he was gone, and my mother was alone and pregnant and already fragile. And I watched her go very quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. She was 34 and pregnant, and the person she loved was dead, and I was 14 and didn't know how to hold any of that. I just kept showing up. I made dinner. I got Lily ready for school. I sat next to my mother on the couch on the nights she couldn't leave it. I didn't have words for what was happening. I just moved toward her when the current moved away, because that was the only thing I knew how to do. Nora was born in a February snowstorm. She came out screaming, fists clenched, furious at the cold air and the lights and the noise, furious at the world for being so much, right from the very first moment. And she has never, really, stopped finding the world too much. She has never stopped feeling it at full volume. The official diagnoses came when she was 3.5, autism, ADHD, OCD, a constellation of things that meant the world reached Nora differently than it reached the rest of us. Louder, sharper, more overwhelming, less filterable, the things that most brains sort into background noise, the seam of a sock, the hum of a refrigerator, the texture of a shirt sleeve, the particular quality of light on a Tuesday afternoon. Her brain couldn't sort. They arrived at full intensity, all of them, all the time, and she had almost no language to explain this to anyone, which meant the only way she could communicate the experience of being Nora in the world was through her body, through screaming and hitting and throwing and scratching and the desperate, self-directed violence of a child who has too much sensation and nowhere to put it. I understood this. I want to be clear about that. I had spent years researching, reading, watching videos, and asking questions in online forums at 2 a.m. while Nora slept. I understood the neuroscience. I understood that her meltdowns were not manipulation or defiance, but overload, overwhelm, a nervous system hitting its absolute ceiling and collapsing under the weight. I understood that the scratching was regulation, not self-destruction, her body finding a way to discharge what it couldn't manage. I understood that she was not choosing to be difficult. She was just trying to survive the experience of existing. But understanding something and living inside it are two entirely different things. And I want to be very honest with you about the gap between them. Because I think that gap is where a lot of people quietly fall apart, and nobody talks about it. When my mother died in November, a health crisis that moved fast, that didn't give us time to brace, everything changed at once. Not just the obvious thing, not just the paperwork, and the guardianship, and the practical nightmare of being 19, and suddenly the legal responsible adult for 2 small children. Everything changed at a cellular level. The air changed, the light changed, the way I moved through the world changed. Grief is not just sadness. I want to say that clearly, because I didn't understand it before it happened to me. Grief is a complete reorganization of your nervous system. It's the sudden absence of something so fundamental to your understanding of reality that reality itself becomes unreliable. My mother was the ground beneath my feet, even when she was difficult, even when she was unavailable, even when I was the one holding things together. She was still there. The possibility of her was still there. And then she wasn't. And the ground went with her, and I had to learn to walk on something else. I had to learn to walk on something else while also being the ground for 2 other people. The first morning after the funeral, I woke up before 5 to Nora's screaming. She'd had a nightmare. She couldn't tell me what it was, only that something had been wrong. And I sat on the floor of her room in the dark and I held her hands, because she doesn't always like to be held, doesn't always tolerate the closeness of another body, but she will sometimes take hands. And I breathed slowly and told her in a quiet voice that we were okay. Knew that it was still nighttime, that nothing was wrong right now. And while I was saying those things in my quiet voice, something was happening inside my chest that I didn't have words for yet. Something that felt like drowning at a very slow speed, like water rising so gradually you almost don't notice until it's at your chin. I didn't cry that first week. I want to tell you that, because I think it's important. People expect you to cry. They expect it to look a certain way, the grief. And when it doesn't, they don't know what to do with you. I didn't cry. I was too busy. There were too many things happening in real time for me to also be having feelings about them. The social worker came, and I answered her question. The lawyer came, and I answered her question. The daycare called, and I talked to them. I made food. I managed Nora's routine. I helped Lily understand, in small and age-appropriate increments, that Mama wasn't coming home. I held Lily while she cried, because Lily cried enough for both of us. My grief went underground. That's the only way I can describe it. It didn't disappear. I don't think grief disappears. I think it just finds different rooms to live in. But it moved somewhere beneath the surface of my daily functioning and waited, patient and enormous, for a moment when I wasn't busy holding everything else up. That moment came about 3 weeks in, at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. Both girls were asleep. I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to fill out a form for the at-home program, a provincial benefit for children with disabilities, and I couldn't figure out one of the questions. Something routine? Something stupid? A question about my mother's previous address or some administrative detail that I should have been able to answer but couldn't, because my brain was full to the rim with everything else and there was no more room, and I just stopped. I put down the pen, I put my forehead on the table, and I cried for probably 45 minutes, quietly, with my face pressed against the papers, because I knew if I made noise, I would wake the girls, and then I would have to stop. That was my grief. 45 minutes on a Wednesday night with my face on a government form. That was what I got. I want to talk about my mother, for a moment, because she existed in a complicated way inside my grief, and I've spent a long time untangling the threads. There's the straightforward grief, the missing of her, the physical reality of her absence, and the way I still reach for my phone sometimes to text her something and then remember. That grief is clean, in its way. It hurts in a way that makes sense, but there's another grief, messier and harder to admit to, that lives alongside the first one. The grief for what we didn't have. The grief for the mother she could have been, and sometimes was, and more often wasn't. The grief for the version of my childhood that could have existed if things had been different. There were years, many years, when I was the adult in our household, not because I chose to be, but because someone had to be, and the person who was supposed to be wasn't available. I don't say this to condemn her. She was fighting something real. She was carrying something heavy that she hadn't chosen, but it marked me, that childhood. In ways I was only starting to understand when she died, and her death took away any possibility of the reconciliation I'd been, without quite admitting it, hoping for. I think I had been waiting for her to get better, not consciously, not as a plan, but as a background hope. The kind you carry without acknowledging, because acknowledging it makes it too fragile. I had been waiting for the version of my mother who would see clearly what had happened between us, who would take up her half of it, who would say something I didn't have words for yet, but would recognize immediately when I heard it. Her death made sure that conversation would never happen, and that's a loss, inside a loss, inside a loss, and I've had to find ways to mourn all of them separately. Yin, which is slow and non-linear, and frequently ambushes you in the cereal aisle of the grocery store at 7:30 on a Saturday morning. Nora's behavior deteriorated significantly in the weeks and months after my mother died. Significantly, measurably, visibly worse. Her meltdowns went from several times a week to several times a day. The self-harm escalated. She was scratching her forearms until they bled, picking at her eyebrows until patches were missing, biting the heels of her hands. She stopped sleeping through the night. She began waking once, twice, sometimes 3 times, disoriented and screaming, and it would take an hour or more to bring her back down each time. I understood what was happening. She was grieving too, in the only language available to her body. She had lost her primary attachment figure, the person who had been, whatever her limitations, Nora's anchor, and her nervous system was responding to that loss the way it responded to every overwhelming thing, at full volume, with everything it had. She couldn't say, "I miss Mama." She couldn't say, "I'm scared." She couldn't say, "The ground is gone, and I don't know how to stand." So she screamed, she threw, she hit, she scratched herself until she bled, because sometimes that was the only way to make the internal noise stop. I knew all of this, and still, there were moments when I stood in the kitchen doorway at 2 in the morning, having been awake for 4 hours already, listening to her scream, and something inside me went very dark and very cold. Not toward her. I want to be careful to say that. Not toward Nora, who was 4 years old and suffering. Toward the situation. Toward the universe maybe. Toward whatever force had arranged things this way. This hot, blind fury at the sheer impossibility of what I was being asked to do, and the fact that I hadn't been asked. It had just been assumed. The world had assumed I would handle it because I was there, and I was the oldest, and there was no one else. No one had asked if I could. No one had asked if I wanted to. It had simply been handed to me, the whole weight of it, and I was expected to carry it, and to keep carrying it, and to do it without breaking. I want to be honest about the resentment too, because it was there. Not always, not constantly, not in a way that ever touched how much I loved both of my sisters, but it was there, real and uncomfortable, the resentment. Toward Nora sometimes, and because everything was harder with her needs amplified by grief, because Lily was suffering from the lack of attention, and there was only so much of me to go around, because I was 20 years old, and I hadn't slept a full night in weeks. That resentment would flare, and then immediately the guilt would come, enormous, suffocating, drowning out everything else, because she was 4, because she was grieving, because she didn't choose any of this any more than I did. The guilt was, in some ways, worse than the resentment. At least the resentment was honest. The guilt was a story I told myself about what kind of person I was. A bad sister, a bad guardian, someone who wasn't enough and would never be enough. Someone who could have been doing more if she'd known more, if she'd been better, if she'd somehow been prepared. And the guilt took everything hard and turned it into evidence of my failure. And I carried it constantly, this low grinding weight of not enough, even as I was working myself to exhaustion trying to be enough. It was my therapist, Dr. Chen, who first named it clearly. She said, "You are performing a perfect guardian character in your head and measuring yourself against her constantly, and that character doesn't exist and has never existed and couldn't. No one could do what you are doing without support and still be perfect. The question isn't whether you are perfect. The question is whether you are showing up." And the answer to that question is obviously yes. I didn't fully believe her the first time she said it. I believed her more the second time. By the third time, something in the architecture of my self-criticism began to shift. Just slightly, just enough to let some air in. The guilt didn't disappear, but it became less totalizing. It became something I could put down for a few hours instead of something I had to carry everywhere, always, attached to everything I did. Let me tell you about the daycare incident, because it matters. About 6 weeks after my mother died, I got a call from the director of Nora's daycare program, a center for neurodivergent kids that my mother had enrolled her in the previous year. The director's voice had that specific quality of professional concern that people use when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear, and they're hoping the tone will cushion the blow. Nora had bitten her primary instructor, not for the first time. There had been incidents before, but this time had broken the skin. They were requesting an emergency meeting. They were strongly suggesting that her current placement was not sustainable. I sat in that meeting in a chair that was slightly too small for an adult, across a table from 3 professionals who clearly knew more about their systems than I did, and I kept my face very still, and I asked the right questions, and I took notes on a yellow legal pad I'd bought, specifically for moments like this, because having something to write on made me feel like I was managing instead of drowning. I asked about their behavior support protocols. I asked what specific incidents had preceded the bite. I asked what accommodations they were currently providing, and what additional ones might be possible. I sounded, I'm told, remarkably composed. Then I went to my car and I screamed into my jacket for about 2 minutes. Not crying, screaming. The specific, raw, animal kind of sound that lives underneath all the composure and professionalism and coping. The sound you only let out when you're sure no one can hear you. Then I drove home and made dinner. The daycare was not ideal. I want to say that plainly. It was a program for neurodivergent kids, which was the right category, but the execution was uneven. High staff turnover, inconsistent application of techniques, and a general approach that seemed oriented toward containment rather than support. There is a difference between those things. Managing a child through a meltdown and supporting a child through a meltdown look similar from the outside, but feel entirely different from inside the child. Management says, "Let's get through this without anything breaking." Support says, "You're okay, I'm here. Let's get through this together." Nora needed the second thing. She was getting more of the first. I knew this, and I was stuck with it, because she was on a waitlist for a better program, and in the meantime, I had to work. And the program that wasn't ideal was still the program that existed. This is one of the most exhausting features of navigating systems as someone without resources. You spend enormous energy identifying what would help, and then enormous energy coming to terms with the fact that what would help is not available right now. You do your best with what exists. You stay on the waitlist. You keep looking. I was working part-time at a grocery store. Unglamorous, yes, but flexible and within walking distance, and managed by a woman named Sandra, who found out about my situation through a coworker and quietly, without making anything of it, never scheduled me before 9 or after 5. She never asked questions. She never offered unsolicited advice, or looked at me with that specific expression that means "I'm so sorry, but also, isn't this fascinating?" She just adjusted my schedule and got on with her day, and that small, practical kindness held me in place in a way she probably doesn't know. The legal situation had been terrifying in those first weeks. My mother had no will. There was no plan. There I was, 19, sitting across from a social worker named Diane in an office with very beige walls, listening to her explain, gently and carefully, that there were options available for the girl's care. I understood what she was saying. I also understood that those options, the options she was delicately laying out in her careful professional voice, would mean my sisters going somewhere else. Somewhere without me, and that was not an option I was willing to consider. I said this, not dramatically, just very clearly. These are my sisters. We stay together. What do I need to do to make that happen? Diane was kind. She referred me to a legal aid program, and through that program I found Priya, the legal aid lawyer whom I will be grateful for until the day I die. Priya was brisk and competent and deeply unimpressed by systems that didn't serve people, and she navigated the guardianship process with an efficiency that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like someone who knew what they were doing was on my side. We got the guardianship arranged. We stayed in the apartment. We stayed together. But the logistics of staying together were relentless. And sometimes I think the logistics were almost harder to survive than the grief, because they demanded a constant forward-facing attention that left no room for the other thing. Every day brought new forms, new phone calls, new systems to navigate. I applied for every benefit I could find. BC's Child Disability Benefit, the Autism Funding Program, which I didn't know existed until Priya mentioned it, and which turned out to be one of the most consequential things I accessed, provincial social housing waitlists. Every subsidy and supplement the internet could suggest. I spent hours on hold. I drove to the offices. When I filled out forms with detailed descriptions of Nora's needs that required me to articulate, in bureaucratic language, all of the hardest things about our daily life. There is something uniquely depleting about having to describe the worst moments of your existence in neat boxes on government forms, something that forces you to make your grief administrative and then move on without acknowledging what just. I was also managing my own grief in these weeks, or rather, I was not managing it because there was no time, and so it was managing me. Grief doesn't wait for you to have time for it. It just lives in your body and surfaces when and where it wants to, indifferent to your schedule. I would be fine, truly fine, functional, present, getting through the day. And then something small would hit me sideways. I had the specific brand of yogurt my mother used to buy. A voicemail I found on my phone from 3 months before she died. Just her voice saying, "Hey, can you call me when you get a chance?" The way Nora made a face one afternoon was exactly, precisely, heartbreakingly, my mother's face. The voicemail undid me completely. I listened to it 17 times in 3 days. I know that probably sounds like something you shouldn't do, like a form of self-harm, but I couldn't stop. It was the last recording of her voice I had, and every time I played it, I was briefly back in the world where she was alive and just wanted me to call her back. And then the message ended, and I was back in the world where she wasn't. And the contrast between those two worlds was its own particular devastation. I started therapy because Priya suggested it, and because I was running out of the kind of willpower that keeps you upright through sheer force. In my first session with Dr. Chen, I told her I was fine. She looked at me with a very specific expression, not unkind, just patient and completely unconvinced. And she said, "I'd like to hear more about fine." And I tried to explain fine, and I cried instead, which was information. Dr. Chen did not tell me I was doing amazingly. She did not perform the sentimental affirmation of the crisis counselor. She was direct in a way that I needed. She said, "You are managing more than most adults could manage with full support, and you have almost none. And the question before us is not how to help you feel better about this, but how to build something underneath you before you fall through the floor. It because the floor is looking thin, and you have 2 children counting on you not to fall through it." That framing, "before you fall through the floor," was the most useful thing anyone said to me in those early months, because I had been framing my coping as a moral achievement, as evidence of my strength, and Dr. Chen was reframing it as a temporary structural situation that required actual structural solutions, not just more willpower. Willpower runs out. Structure doesn't have to. I needed support workers. I needed connection. I needed actual human help from actual humans. And I needed to become someone who could ask for those things, which meant I needed to examine the belief, deep and old and installed very early, that asking for help was a form of weakness, that needing people was dangerous, where that the only reliable thing was yourself. That belief had been useful once. It had kept me functional through years of instability. It had made me capable of doing things at 14 and 15 that most adults wouldn't be asked to do. But it was not useful anymore. It was, in fact, a liability. It was the thing that kept me grinding alone when help was available, if I could find a way to reach for it. Slowly, carefully, I started reaching. The behavioral support worker came through Nora's autism funding, a woman named Tomomi, who showed up at our apartment twice a week for 3 months and changed our lives in ways I'm still processing. Tomomi was patient in a deep, settled way, not the performed patience of someone doing a job, but the real kind, the kind that comes from genuine interest in the person in front of you. She worked directly with Nora, yes, on communication strategies, on sensory regulation, on building Nora's capacity to signal her needs before they escalated past the point of no return. But she also spent enormous amounts of time with me. She didn't treat me as a client's caregiver. She treated me as a person doing an extraordinarily difficult thing who deserved to understand the science of what she was dealing with. She explained co-regulation, the concept that a child whose nervous system is dysregulated will look to the adult around her for cues about whether the current situation is survivable. The child cannot regulate herself yet. She borrows the regulation from you. Your calm is information her body needs, which means, Tomomi told me gently but directly, that when you're in fight or flight yourself, you're transmitting fight or flight, and she's receiving it, and it escalates the loop instead of breaking it. This was both useful and pressure. It put something on me, but it also gave me something to do with the anxiety. Instead of just feeling it, I could channel it into the active practice of modeling calm, which meant having my feelings somewhere they didn't leak out at Nora, which meant crying in the shower, which meant screaming in the car, which meant calling Dr. Chen on Wednesday afternoons and pouring everything out so I didn't have to carry it into the evenings. There's a specific kind of loneliness in being the only adult in a household with 2 small children and no one else to debrief with at the end of the day. Adults need to process out loud. We need to say to another adult, "Today was hard. This happened. I felt this." What do you think? We need witnesses to our experience. I didn't have that. My friends, the people I'd been in school with, the ones I'd been excited to be around in my first weeks of university, were 19 and doing 19-year-old things. I didn't blame them for being unable to relate. I just felt the distance between our lives like a physical thing, a widening gap, and I stopped trying to explain across it. There was a night, I think it was late January, about 3 months after my mother died, when Lily came to find me after I'd put them both to bed. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, not upset, just looking at me. I asked what was wrong. She said, very matter-of-factly, "I know you're not okay, Maya. I just want to say I know." She was 5. She had been watching me, sure in the way that children watch the adults they depend on, carefully, without appearing to, cataloging the signs of distress that I thought I was hiding. She had seen me, and she had come to tell me that she had, and that it didn't change anything, that she was still okay, that I didn't have to pretend to be fine for her. I sat down on the kitchen floor, and I held my arms out, and she came and sat in my lap, and we sat there for a while without saying anything, and I thought, this child is going to be extraordinary. She is already extraordinary. She is 5 years old, and she has more emotional intelligence than most of the adults I have ever known. And somehow, against all the odds of the chaotic life we'd all been born into, she has grown into someone who knows how to offer comfort without making anyone feel small. I also thought, she should not have to do this. She should be 5 and worried about nothing more serious than which stuffed animal to sleep with. And she is instead worried about me, because she is also a child who lost her mother. And now the person she has left is visibly struggling, and she is picking up the slack in the only way available to a 5-year-old, which is by being perceptive and steady and kind. She was doing emotional labor, and she deserved better. That night was the catalyst for the Lily Hour. Every evening after that, I carved out 1 hour that was just for her. Just the 2 of us. No Nora, no phone, no crisis management. Reading together, puzzles, a show she liked, whatever she wanted. An hour of my complete and undivided presence. It didn't fix the fundamental imbalance, but it mattered to her in a way I could see. Something relaxed in her face during those hours. Some ongoing watchfulness went quiet, and she was just a kid for a little while. I want to tell you about the relationship between Lily and Nora, because it's complicated and I've had to think about it carefully. Lily, at 5, had been living with Nora's intensity her entire life. She had grown up with a sister who had more needs, who took more attention, who could make any outing a crisis. She had learned, somewhere along the way, to make herself smaller and quieter and easier. A very common adaptation in siblings of kids with complex needs, and one that breaks my heart in retrospect. She had become low maintenance because she'd had to be. After all, the system rewarded low maintenance, and that's not a fair thing to ask of a 5-year-old. There were moments, more in those first months than later, when Lily said things that revealed the depth of what she was carrying. She told me once that she knew I loved Nora more. She said it without accusation, just as a statement of observed fact, the way children say things that are too large for them, without fully understanding what they mean, but meaning them completely. I had to stop what I was doing and sit down right there in the kitchen and pull her onto my lap and say the truest thing I knew how to say. I do not love either of you more. I love you the same, completely, in every direction. Nora needs more help right now. Needing more help and being loved more are not the same thing, but the help looks different from the outside, and I understand why it seems uneven. I don't know if she believed me. That I kept trying to make it true in the daily texture of things, to find ways to make my love for her visible and specific and undeniable, to show her that she was seen. Not just as the easy one, not just as the one who didn't need anything, but as herself, particular, and loved and worth showing up for completely. There were still terrible days in those months. There were weeks when I lost count of the days because they blurred together into a single continuous experience of getting through. There was a Tuesday in February when Nora had 4 meltdowns before noon, each one leaving her wrung out and disoriented, each one leaving me a little more depleted, and Lily had quietly wet herself at school, because she'd been too anxious to ask to use the bathroom. Nuts, and when I picked her up, her teacher gave me a look that I interpreted as judgment even if it wasn't, and I drove home and sat in the parking spot outside our apartment for 10 minutes before I could make myself go up. There was the morning I found Nora had scratched her arm badly in the night, really badly, deep and raw, and she was sitting in her bed looking at it with a kind of curious detachment that was its own specific horror. I cleaned and bandaged her arm, and I held her hands and breathed with her, the way Tomomi had shown me. And I kept my voice calm and my face soft, and inside, I was screaming, because I was so scared and so exhausted, and because she was bleeding, and I was her only protection between her and a world that was constantly too much for her, and I was just me, just Maya, had you 20 years old and not enough, and trying anyway, but something shifted, in increments. Nora's new daycare program opened up, a spot on a waitlist I'd been on since the week after my mother died. The director called me herself to offer it, and I stood in the kitchen and pressed my hand over my mouth and didn't cry until after I hung up. The new program had staff who kept notes, who called me with updates and not just incident reports, who knew Nora's name and her specific triggers and her good days, who said, the first time I picked her up, she had a really good day. She helped set the table for a snack. I cried in the parking lot, not sad crying, the other kind. I went back to university, part-time, remotely, one course at a time, not the full first year I'd planned. Not the version of my life where I was on campus and becoming someone new in the ordinary ways that 19-year-olds become someone new. Just one course, an English literature seminar that I took specifically because I needed something that was mine, something organized around ideas and language, and the life of the mind, rather than crisis management and logistics and need. I read books at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep. I wrote essays at midnight. I had opinions about things that had nothing to do with behavioral support strategies or social housing waitlists. And those opinions mattered to exactly one person, my professor, who gave me a B+ on my first paper and wrote in the margin, strong argument, keep going. I kept those words on my phone for weeks, strong argument, keep going. The Facebook group matters too. And I want to mention it because it was one of the things I was most reluctant about and one of the most genuinely useful. A woman named Ingrid, the mother of Lily's kindergarten best friend, invited me to a group for Vancouver area parents and caregivers of autistic kids. I resisted for a month. I didn't see myself as belonging in that category. I wasn't a parent. I was a sister, a guardian, a 19-year-old doing her best. But Ingrid asked twice, gently, and eventually I joined. And then I was up at 2 a.m. during a bad stretch, and I posted something raw and honest, half expecting nothing. And what I received instead was a cascade of responses from people who had been in the same trench. Parents and siblings and aunts and foster parents and older brothers. All the people who had loved someone with complex needs and been alone in it and found each other, eventually, in a Facebook group at 2 a.m. That community didn't solve anything, but it made me feel less like I had invented this impossible situation, less like it was a reflection of something particular and broken about my family or me. It was a reminder that there are a lot of people quietly carrying impossible things, and that reaching across to each other is sometimes the only available structural support we have. I want to say something about resentment and guilt now, because I've been circling them throughout this story, and I want to land on them directly, because I think they are the two things people are least willing to be honest about when they're caring for someone with complex needs. And I think that dishonesty costs people enormously. The resentment is real. Not constant, not all-consuming, not something I'm proud of, but real. It comes from depletion, and depletion is a fact. When I am running on almost nothing, when the nights have been bad and the days have been hard and I have given everything I have and the well is empty, there is a version of me that surfaces who feels something dark toward the situation she's in, not toward Nora, toward the weight of it, toward the relentlessness of it, toward the fact that I am 20 and I have not slept through the night in 3 weeks. That version of me is not generous or patient or gracious. She is exhausted and angry, and she wants something different. When I feel her surface now, I try not to fight her. Fighting her just drives her underground, where she festers. Instead, I try to treat what she's saying as information. I am depleted. I need to find a way to refill before I can be useful again. I need to call Tomomi, or go to therapy, or ask Ingrid to take the girls for an afternoon, or simply sit in the car for 10 minutes before I make myself go upstairs. The resentment is not who I am. It is a signal about my state. And signals, treated honestly, are more useful than emotions suppressed. The guilt is harder. The guilt is the story I told myself about what it meant that I was struggling, that it meant I was failing, that it meant I wasn't enough, that if I had known more, done more, been more, somehow the situation would be better. This story is a lie, and it is also very sticky. It attached itself to everything. Every meltdown was evidence. Every sleepless night was evidence. Every moment when I raised my voice slightly or cried in front of the girls or couldn't manage something with grace, I thought I should manage it with evidence, evidence, evidence. What Dr. Chen helped me see over months and many Wednesday afternoons was that this version of accountability, guilt as self-punishment, guilt as evidence of inadequacy, was not actually making me better at caring for my sisters. It was just hurting me. Real accountability looks different. Real accountability says, that approach didn't work. What would work better? It is oriented toward the future, not the past. It doesn't require you to flagellate yourself for what you couldn't know. I was 14 when I started caring for Nora. I was a child doing an adult job, doing my best, learning everything I knew through direct experience and sheer necessity. I showed up every day. I kept showing up. That is not the resume of someone who failed. That is the resume of someone who loved imperfectly and persistently, which is, I think, the only way anyone really loves anyone. I am still tired. I want to be honest about that too. Because I think stories like this can veer into a false resolution, the part where everything clicks into place, and the hard thing becomes easy, and you emerge from your trials transformed and effortless. That's not what happened. I'm still tired. There are still terrible days. Last month, Nora had a regression that I couldn't fully explain. A week of escalating behavior that took us back to the worst of the early months, and I spent 4 of those nights on the floor of her room just being present, just weathering it with her. I got a stomach bug the same week Lily did, which meant I was ill and sleepless, and still responsible for 2 children who needed things. I cried in the shower 3 mornings in a row. I called Tomomi, who talked me through it. I called Dr. Chen, who reminded me that regressions are part of the pattern, not the whole pattern, and that I had gotten through this before and I would get through it again. And I did. We did. Nora is 5 now. She turned 5 in February, in another snowstorm, which felt like a kind of continuity. Born in a storm, arriving in a storm, always a little too much for whatever room she's in. She is still loud and still challenging and still occasionally launches objects with accuracy that I can only describe as athletic. She cannot always tell me she loves me in words, but she has a communication app now that has given her a language she didn't have before, and she uses it to tell me she's hungry and scared and happy, and that she doesn't like the sound the neighbor's dog makes. She uses it to show me things. She used it last week to show me a picture of a cat, and then look at me with an expression that clearly meant, "This is a cat. Have you considered a cat?" The answer should be yes. I have not gotten a cat. But last week she climbed into my lap while I was reading. Just climbed in, unprompted, and settled herself against my chest and made a small sound that was unmistakably content. She stays. She keeps choosing to stay in the space between us, and when I think about everything that costs her, how much it costs her to exist in a world that was not built for her, how much courage it takes to keep showing up in a body that won't quiet down, I am in awe of her. I am genuinely, deeply in awe of her. Lily is 6 now. She is reading chapter books and has a best friend named Rosa and has recently decided she wants to be a doctor when she grows up. She said it very seriously, like a vow. I want to help kids like Nora. She is 6. She said it like she had been thinking about it for a long time. I looked at her. This 6-year-old girl who has already survived more than most adults, who cried enough for both of us in the first months, who came to find me in the kitchen at 5 years old to say, "I know you're not okay." And I thought, whatever I am doing or failing to do, whatever mistakes I am making and have made and will make, she is going to be extraordinary. She already is. I am still in university, part-time, still figuring out what shape my life is going to take. I have a small, real, imperfect support system. Tomomi, Dr. Chen, Ingrid, the Facebook group, Sandra at the grocery store with her quiet schedule adjustments. I have learned, slowly and with enormous resistance, to reach toward other people when I need something instead of just grinding alone. I am not perfect at it. I still sometimes try to handle things alone until they're already in crisis, and then I call someone and wonder why I waited. But I'm getting better at it. The gap between needing and asking is narrower than it used to be. And I have, this is important I think, started to mourn my mother more fully. Not just the fact of losing her, but all of it. The complicated reality of her. The ways she failed me, and the ways she loved me, and the ways those two things are not opposites, are in fact the same story told from different angles. I can hold more of her now than I could in those first months, when all I had room for was the administrative grief, the forms, the caseworkers, and the getting through. I can hold the memory of her laugh. I can hold the memory of her failures. I can hold the fact that I am angry at her sometimes, and that the anger and the love are not in conflict. I can hold the conversation we never got to have, mourn it, and carry it forward. I am still figuring out what it means to grow up like this, in this specific shape, with these specific people. I don't think I would have chosen it, but I also don't think I would trade it. And I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say to make their hard things feel meaningful, but I mean it in a specific way. I have become someone I would not have become otherwise. Careful, attentive to people's needs, deeply patient in ways that were not available to me at 19 when this started. Good at sitting with discomfort instead of fleeing it. I have become someone my sisters can count on. And whatever else I have or haven't figured out, that is a thing I'm proud of. That is the ending I have to offer. Not a fairy tale. Not a rescue from an unexpected direction. Not the hard thing, resolving neatly. Just a girl who was dropped into the deep end at 19, who taught herself to swim, who kept swimming even when she was swallowing water, who is still swimming now, forward. Always forward, with her sisters beside her. If this story found you because you're in something hard, if you're a young caregiver navigating impossible logistics, if you're a sibling who became a guardian, if you're grieving while also having to hold everything together for everyone else, I want you to hear this. Showing up is enough to start. Not having all the answers, not being perfectly regulated, not crying on the bathroom floor or screaming into your jacket or resenting things you shouldn't resent, just showing up and finding one phone call and one support worker and one act of unexpected kindness at a time that you are not quite as alone as you thought. There is help available. It's not always easy to find. It's not always fast. And the systems that are supposed to provide it are imperfect in ways that will make you want to give up. Don't give up. Stay on the wait lists. Fill out the forms. Ask the questions. Reach toward the people who seem willing to hold something. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep looking for the next handhold. And to you, watching this, if this story moved you, if something in it touched something in you, if it made you feel less alone or more understood, or simply like someone had said out loud the thing you'd been carrying quietly, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one, and more people finding stories like this one matters, because connection matters, and being seen matters, and knowing you are not alone in the impossible thing matters more than I can say. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep hearing stories like this. Every week, we bring you real, raw, honest accounts of women who have carried impossible things and kept going anyway. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they loved someone and they showed up and they found, slowly and imperfectly, that showing up was enough. I'll see you in the next one.